Terror in Ohio. In 1981, a family living in rural northeast Ohio have several close encounters with Sasquatch. But these terrifying experiences become a living nightmare as their house is besieged by shadow people and UFOs, forcing them to take to their rifles to keep themselves safe. Will they be able to hold out until the morning comes? Or will they become victims of the night siege of Ohio?
Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Eli Watson. Now it's been a little while since I've done an episode, and I really wanted to come back into the show strong and do something that really lived up to the name of the show, Mysteries and Monsters. And I think I found the perfect case for that. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to talk a little bit about how I learned about this story. So as many of you may know, I started my work with STM back in 2021, and on the very first shoot, I met Mark Matsky and Andy Matsky, who are both fabulous people. Mark Matsky, of course, has done many of the narrations for Small Town Monsters films, as well as some of my own projects. And his son, Andy, is absolutely fantastic. Andy and I hit it off really fast. Maybe that's because both of us were the youngest people in the crew at the time, so I think Andy's about 2 years younger than I am. Either way, we hit it off, and through Andy and through his podcast, Somewhere in Ohio, is where I learned about this story, which all centers around this book called Night Siege, the Northern Ohio UFO Creature Invasion, written by a guy named Dennis Polichis. And the book really chronicles these series of events that happens out on this property in Northern Ohio, and it's super bizarre. And believe you me, we're gonna get into it. We're gonna look at all the details of this story. But first, I want to let Mark explain some of the more finer details.
The Night Siege itself describes over the course of a few weeks during the summer of 1981, where one family in particular started to experience phenomena that started out as a rather straightforward kind of Bigfoot encounter, but then quickly escalated into a very bizarre realm that would include orbs, shadow people waving lighted devices in the wood line, actual UFOs hovering overhead, and the reaction of this family being one of fright, obviously, distress, and also taking multiple shots at all of these entities with firearms. And so the idea of the Night Siege, I think, comes from the fact that at one point, both the family and Dennis Polichis and other researchers who became involved in this case saw as many as 6 Sasquatch-like figures approaching the homestead at which all of these sightings occurred, and felt that they were under some sort of attack.
And that is just the tip of the iceberg, because this whole story gets really insane. And honestly, that's kind of the reason why Mark got into it in the first place.
I mean, I make no apologies for being interested in the stranger end of the Bigfoot phenomena. Not that I put stock in it or quote unquote believe it, but it blows my mind, and it's entertaining to me to see how these things bleed together at a certain point historically. Because I grew up at a time when the very first Bigfoot literature that was coming out was dealing with sort of Bigfoot in a silo, right? In other words, only looking at the Bigfoot phenomena as something to be pursued, that there's this humanoid figure, hairy, tall, ape man, that's all it is. As strange as it is to most people, that's all it is. But as the literature develops over time, from mid-60s, late 60s to early 70s, suddenly you have this growing willingness on the part of many authors to say, the truth of the matter is, with these Bigfoot reports, we also get reports of orbs, UFOs, other unexplained phenomena kind of happening in tandem with the Bigfoot. And even you can look at Ohio cases like the Minerva Monster, where it's not only the Minerva Monster, but there's a UFO flap happening at the same time. And the Minerva Monster itself is cited with 2 other creatures that are described as Black Panthers. And it's just this crossover of strange phenomena that happens that there's something about that appeals to me. Where some people see that as limiting and think as soon as you start adding one inexplicable thing to another, none of it can happen. To me, it's more a matter of, well, why not? If one thing is this bizarre, why can't 2 things that strange be together, or even 3? And that's touched on, of course, by thinkers and writers like Gray Barker, and to a larger extent John Keel, who puts forth the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis that there is some sort of trickster force that likes to simply mess with human perception. See what we'll do if 4 lights appear that shoot lights down into your woods that results in dark, red-eyed figures running around your property. What would we do? I kind of enjoy, at least hypothetically, thinking through, what would I do if I had that experience? And I guess that's my attraction to it.
There is a great saying, like father, like son. And I believe that's the case here. So Mark obviously has an interest in high strangeness cases. And it would seem that because of his father's interest in it, Andy also has an interest in it.
I found out about Night Siege because we had a printed out copy of it sitting on a bookshelf for the longest time in this house. And then just one day during the pandemic, it piqued my interest and I started looking into it. And I couldn't stop for a little bit. But I heard about it from my dad, because I think they did a podcast episode about it or something like that. Already I'd been interested in the work of Stan Gordon and kind of that classic era of high strangeness. And so when I found out there was something that, hits that level of high strangeness that happened half an hour from where we lived, it blew my mind that had happened and that no one was talking about it. So it really captivated my interest, as it seemed like this was an untapped area of research and it was close to home. It was almost right down the road.
So I can relate a lot to Andy here. If you guys remember, the second episode of this series is called The Mountain of God UFO Cult, which focuses on a case about this UFO cult that existed in my hometown of Temecula, California. And when you have a case that takes place so close to home, and it's like literally 30 minutes away from my house, just like the Night Siege location is 30 minutes away from Andy's house, it really creates an attraction to that case like nothing else does, Like, I can be interested in the Bray Road Beast, but that's Wisconsin, that's half a country away, versus something that took place down the street. You spend so much time looking into it because it just means a lot more to you on a personal level than say, like the Kinderhook creature would mean to me. So I really sympathize and I understand where Andy's coming from in this situation. And so while Mark is the one who may have discovered Night Siege in the first place, it was really Andy who took over the research.
So this is the work I've done. So this is the work I've done. Just trying to verify as much as I can about the story, what takes place in the story, kind of basic facts. Because Pilichus withholds so much information, just trying to verify anything was kind of a goal. Because it's such a fantastic story, trying to see if anything really happened was a goal of mine. And as I began to do that, I began to be able to verify that, little details like the fact that an oil pipeline, an oil well or natural gas well was being dug at the time actually happened, being able to find the, public records of that, and trying to substantiate other names that Pilichus almost seems to offhandedly mention, other researchers like Willard McIntyre, people like that, just trying to find out as much details of the case as possible, because Pilichus basically gives an overview. And so trying to figure out things like that, and then spending a good amount of time out near where the location happened and around where my best guess of where it actually took place, spending time out there. In the back of the book, I was really interested by this. In the back of Night Siege, Pilichus gives what I think it's the Page Research Library, or what his personal library is, and I try to track down as many of those as I could. Again, trying to find kind of the facts of the matter. What you see is at the time, there was a plethora of contemporary sources about Bigfoot in Ohio. So things like Big Head and the Minerva Monster, those cases being reported in nationally circulated UFO and Bigfoot sources. So that's more my research. So the setting of Night Siege is it takes place in 1981. And that's really interesting to me because that's coming right after this wave of Bigfoot reports in the 1970s. Within Ohio, within the previous decade of when Night Siege takes place, you have things like the Minerva Monster. You have the Big Head story coming out of Mansfield, and you have the Loveland Frogman. You have cryptozoology, as we'd call it now, Fortean phenomena, sort of coming to the forefront of public attention in Ohio. And kind of just when we think that's dying off in our minds, this story happens.
The events of Night Siege take place during a wave of heightened Bigfoot awareness. So, like we said already, the Minerva Monster case had just happened in Ohio, but in the greater scheme of things, you have, 14 years before this case, the Patterson-Gimlin film, which was shown around the country in movie theaters and things like that. The Legend of Boggy Creek has been shown around the country, and you even have a resurgence of the interest in the Ape Canyon story, which, even though that occurred in 1924, the only book written on the topic, which is written by Fred Beck, it's called I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens, was published in the late 1960s. So all of this is kind of floating around the same time. Stan Gordon's on the scene, so everything's kind of building up to this, and it would certainly seem like Night Siege was certainly a logical next step in terms of the high strangeness aspect of the Sasquatch world, if that makes sense. And if you're interested in any of the high strangeness stuff that has been talked about thus far, STM has covered plenty of it. So you have The Invasion of Chestnut Ridge, which focuses on Stan Gordon, as well as Sasquatch Unearthed the Ridge, which I put together and Mark Matzke narrated. You also have the upcoming Phantom Lights, which was directed by my good friend Tyler Hall, and that comes out on the 30th of this month, primetime spooky season. And of course you have Buckeye Bigfoot, the new series that's ongoing currently on the YouTube channel right now, which focuses a lot about Ohio Bigfoot. And of course, how can you forget the very first film that kick-started Small Town Monsters, The Minerva Monster, which came out, I think, 2015, 2016. So definitely we've covered a lot of this kind of stuff before. So if you're interested, that's all good stuff to watch in order to kind of set up the scene better for Night Siege.
You have to keep in mind that at this time in history, there's a great deal of overlap in this region of Ohio and also southwest Pennsylvania of strange Bigfoot sightings, creatures that evidently leave 3-toed tracks instead of 5-toed tracks, and the growing acceptance of UFOs and orbs and strange lights as being part of the mix of what was being experienced. You know, I mentioned the name Ron Schaffner. He's one person who kept detailed records of what was happening down in Logan County, Vinton County, southeast Ohio, places today that are sort of assumed to be Bigfoot hot spots. But back then, no one was really thinking of Ohio as a Bigfoot place to concentrate your attention upon, except for these sort of newsletter publishing researchers and investigators. And I think the fact that also in southwest Pennsylvania you had people like Stan Gordon and his various organizations, his connections to MUFON and other UFO investigation groups, that there was a growing sense in the exchange of reports, communication between groups, that perhaps there was some type of unified theory that would explain both Bigfoot and UFOs together. Obviously, pre-internet, you've got people communicating by phone and by sending stuff to each other through the mail. And if they were trying to do a blast of information out, it would have to be self-produced, stapled, and stuck in an envelope and sent to somebody. So it was moving at a bit of a slower pace than we're used to today. And there was probably on balance more interpersonal invitations being issued, like something weird's happening out here, come visit, and hopefully something will happen. What's so odd about these 70s and 80s reports is that when those invitations would happen and people would come out to visit, or often than not, things would appear to happen. And I think it's a valid question to ask, why is that?
And so while we have the context that Night Siege is taking place in pretty well mapped out, the one thing that I'm curious about is the author, Dennis Pauliczis, because I've certainly have never heard of him prior to looking into Night Siege, and he's not really mentioned in other people's works. I know Andy has reached out to Stan Gordon and asked him about Pauliczis, and Stan Gordon has said that he doesn't know or has never heard of him. Although I know people like Don Keating have talked to Pauliczis in the past. So he was definitely involved, but to what extent remains unclear. And I think my biggest question still, even after researching this case, is who was Dennis Pauliczis and what do we know about him?
He lived for a time, at least, in the Rome, Ohio area in Ashtabula County. And some of his publications, Night Siege being one, has a P.O. box address that would go to Rome, Ohio. He managed a couple of newsletters for a time that were all interested in both the UFO and Bigfoot and other unexplained topics. And those are more available than the original Night Siege was. You can still find those for a relatively reasonable price online. But he was in that late 70s, early 80s group of researchers that networked with one another, compared notes, shared reports, and made those available largely through subscription newsletters that were then, hand mailed out to whoever wanted one.
I know very little about Dennis Pauliczis. A lot of what I know is from the little bio and little biographical details we get in Night Siege, and other evidence is purely happenstance, kind of putting together what he's doing in his life. He seems to have had an interest, certainly had an interest in Fortean phenomena before Night Siege happened. And he certainly seems to have an interest after it happens. There's a few things that I've found, I believe from the late 80s, and names he's associated with, Tom Page of the Page Research Library. Those names definitely continuing their involvement in the phenomenon into the 2000s.
Now, he was a contemporary of people like Ron Schaffner, who himself had a self-distributed newsletter. He was also acquainted with Don Keating, for example, and Stan Gordon as well. I mean, it's interesting that in Night Siege, the prologue is actually written by Dr. Bertold Schwartz, who was a known name among the 70s UFO Bigfoot researchers. People that Stan Gordon worked with were taken through hypnotic regression by Dr. Schwartz, and he actually sets up the whole Night Siege story. It's kind of remarkable. Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know nearly enough about Dennis Polichis, or as much as I would like to.
Now let's take a look at the book itself, because mine's actually a print-on-demand copy that I got off of Amazon for like 13 bucks. I'm not sure who produces them, because you can find copies of Night Siege online as a PDF for free, but somebody is making them print-on-demand, so if you open mine up, you know, it says it was printed in Las Vegas the exact same day that I bought it, so I'm not sure what that's all about. But I understand that prior to, you know, internet digitization, finding an actual copy of the pamphlet was actually pretty difficult.
Well, yeah, the Night Siege itself was a self-published booklet or pamphlet. It came out in 1982. As Polichis describes it, it all centers around a man named Robert S. That does not seem to be a pseudonym, and I say that because Polichis reproduces police reports in Night Siege in which Robert S. is used, so unless the police were using a pseudonym, it seems that Robert S. is the name of the principal father at the heart of this family that was having this experience. In May of 1981, there were some Amish woodcutters that were working on the property, and they experienced a series of strange events, including something slashing into their horses' feed bags at first, and then actually slashing the horse itself. A number of gunshots were heard coming from the Amish men. When they were asked about it when they came out of the woods, they said that they were shooting at snakes, but there was obvious damage done to their horse, and they didn't return to the site for about a month. So that's a little bit of weirdness that was happening on that property.
Now we get to my favorite sentence in the whole book. Around this same time, about June 15th, 1981, 4 ducks and 1 chicken went into the woods and never came out. Thanks, Santino, for that lovely animation. But in all seriousness, these ducks and that 1 chicken were found mutilated. Their heads were bitten off, but they hadn't really been eaten. And so they were found by this farmer who found them in the forest, and he buried them out in the forest and decided not to say anything to his family, except to Polichis later on.
But things really kick off on June 25th, 1981. The boys in the family report seeing a large black figure.
It was described as having big red eyes and was walking on all fours, and they shot at it.
When it was shot at, it let out a blood-curdling scream and ran away down a road, and that's how things start off. The next day, June 26th, around 2 a.m., the dad hears dogs barking outside, their dogs barking, and then the barks turn into a whimper. He goes out to investigate, turns a flashlight on, a figure about 30 feet away from him. It just stood there. He scanned it up and down with the flashlight. About 9 feet tall, black hair, glowing red eyes that he said were the size of baseballs. And when it got hit with the light, it started to emit a low growl that just shook this guy to the core. Robert S. says in a later interview that he felt he was going to have a heart attack on the spot.
So Robert runs back inside and he yells to his boy,
"Come on, boys, get your pants on, let's go!"
He grabs his gun, they sneak out the front door.
Get in a truck and go down the road to their neighbors. Meanwhile, hearing all this loud crashing coming from the woods, sort of paralleling their vehicle. But there's a hint of sort of the unusual element to this in the sense that their truck, which was filled with gas and in good repair on the way back to their own home, just stopped working, stalled. So finally they did get it operational, got it home. But needless to say, the dad in particular was shaken by what he had seen, because he had essentially seen a 9-foot tall, red glowing-eyed Sasquatch at 30 feet distance from him.
Now, before we continue the story, I think this is a good time to point out that there seems to be some corroborating evidence for this particular event. And maybe evidence isn't the right word, but it did, in fact, make it into the news in Rome, Ohio. And you really, really have to credit Andy Matsky's sleuthing abilities, because he is the one who tracked down these newspapers. And Andy actually took me to a local library where they have these newspaper articles.
Is this for the vlog
Yeah.
or the mysteries?
I mean, whatever you want.
All right. Hey, okay. Worse. Whoa.
So what's really cool is like, this is the only way to see this. This isn't digitized. This isn't on newspapers.com. You get to like come here. So like, when I started researching this, when Dad and I came here, like I opened this, and this was like really here. It was like, blew my mind. Because it's like one of these details that's actually real.
That sighting was reported in the local newspaper, made the front page, and it's that newspaper article that gets the attention of Dennis Polichis, that brings him out. And it's that newspaper article that I've been able to validate that that's real, that that really did happen. A strange beast roams in Rome really was on the front page of the paper, and that piqued the interest of a young 14 investigator who went out to look.
Now we enter the true high strangeness of this story, which begins the next night, June 28th, 1981. Night falls, and the family notices this figure standing out at the woodline, but not like a Sasquatch, more like a shadow person. And it's waving this blue light back and forth. And they describe it as kind of looking like someone holding a flashlight. And having had their experience the night before, they're just like, we're gonna shoot this thing. And so they grab their guns at the ready, and right before they shoot it, it just vanishes.
And as soon as that happens, forms with red glowing eyes start to walk out of the woods and appear to be approaching the homestead.
They don't waste any time. They start blasting these creatures. One of them's hit, it falls down to the ground, and they're thinking they have this creature.
At least in these initial phases, whenever one of these were shot or shot at, they would let out a scream. This one screamed and fell to the ground. Out of the woodline came two others, one of which breaks east, the other west, leading the family to assume that they were being surrounded.
June 29, 1981, approximately 5 a.m. Robert S. reported that on Wednesday and Thursday evening of late last week, he and his family were awakened by loud growling and activity in the front and backyard. When he went to check the disturbance, they reportedly saw a large black-colored animal standing about 7 to 9 feet tall. Each time they shined a light on the animal or attempted to shoot it, it would run off into the woods.
On the 29th of June, this becomes a matter of public record because the police were called twice out to the location. They filed reports, again, which Pilichis produces in the book. And that was largely, the first one was a noise complaint for the growls and howls that they were hearing. And in that police report is reproduced essentially the one that took place with the 9-foot-tall creature sighted at close range. Same day, a woman who was I believe a family member or a close friend called again because I think she was just so creeped out by the occurrence of the red-eyed creatures and all of these things taking place. She wanted the police to come out again, which they did. They filed a report. It's in the book, but essentially says that they went out, talked to the witnesses. They themselves didn't see any activity, but they did locate tracks in the field, the ones that presumably the family had seen as well.
On July 1st of 1981, just 2 days after these events, Dennis Pilichis comes out to the property for the first time. In the introduction, he writes, "When I first came on the scene, I found obvious things right off that substantiated their story as presented in this report. There were 2 ladders up against the family house. Up on the roof were coffee cups, flashlights, and coats. The yard was covered with spent shotgun shells. The family was in a great state of agitation and stress. The family appeared to be honest, troubled, and confused by what they were going through. When I first met the family, I did not bring up the terms Bigfoot, aliens, or UFOs. I did not even introduce myself as a Bigfoot/UFO investigator. I told the family I was a local person from the area and interested in the strange going-ons. It was not the time for such subject matters to be injected into the interviews. I felt it was best for the people involved to tell me what they had to tell in their own way at that time. Later, after the case had been established and it was obvious what we had in the situation, did I inform the family of some of the past incidents that have taken place in Ohio and other areas." So it seems that Pilichis' first investigation was not necessarily into the more strange things happening at the time, but rather something a little bit more mundane. So you have to remember that the biggest piece of information that was public knowledge at the time was the story of Robert S. seeing the creature 9 feet tall at close range, shining the flashlight on him, getting in the truck, etc. So in an interesting turn of events here, Pilichis' first investigation on the property is actually in relation to the June 25th encounter, which has the creature on all fours with the red eyes hunting the ducks. And even more interesting is that they actually found tracks of whatever this creature was. Now, these weren't normal tracks. They were 7 by 8 inches, kind of circular, 3-toed, so definitely not like a Sasquatch-like footprint. Very strange, very unusual. Pilichis asserts that this is the first time that field had been investigated, and that they found over 40 of these tracks leading from the house to these oil and gas wells to the west of the property. The tracks had a 6-foot stride and appeared to be bipedal. Pilichis claims that the tracks would disappear for a while and then reappear on the other side of the void, as he called it. I'm not sure what kind of a tracker Pilichis was, but I feel like there's a lot of reasons why tracks might disappear in the dirt. You know, like the soil is harder in one area than it is in others. But it's hard without knowing more information to say maybe these tracks were disappearing, or maybe, you know, the terrain was uneven. But without additional information, you can't say one way or the other. Dennis, however, does write. I have no idea what might have made a track like this. They have been compared to 3-toed dinosaur tracks found along the Paluxy River near Glen Rose, Texas. These Tyrannosaurus rex tracks were found in situ with man-like tracks 17 inches long. Is there more information about that? Does anyone know more about Tyrannosaurus rex tracks being found in Texas? 'Cause that's cool. The black forms and strange light sources associated with these events are a deeply puzzling aspect of the ongoing manifestations. The forms do not appear to be the Bigfoot-type creatures that have been seen. The Bigfoots and the black forms have both been seen at the same time. The black forms do not have the red glowing eyes, but do, at times, have a soft white glow around their human-like forms. The most interesting aspect that sticks out to me out of that entire piece there is that the shadow people and the Sasquatch are seemingly two different phenomena. And it's possible that there's an indication that there's two different phenomena happening simultaneously. But we'll talk more about my theories and things like that towards the end. Let's get back to the story.
So it gets even stranger. On July 1st of 1981, the family had gotten into the habit at this point of stationing a couple of themselves on the roof for reasons of being able to see things come in, I suppose, get a cleaner shot at something. I don't know exactly what their motivation was for being on the roof. It's never directly stated in the book, but that's where some of them were hanging out. Guns at the ready, of course. And while they were up there, they saw 4 lights hovering over the wood line towards the back. They were described in terms of like large oil containers, refinery tanks, that sort of somewhat cylindrical object, changing color. And then one sent a beam down into the woods. It flashed. The comment was made it was as light as day. And then all manner of things break loose at that point.
And suddenly they hear what sounds like a woman screaming at the wood line. And then all the lights go out. And as the lights go out, they start seeing these shadow people running along the wood line. And they're shooting at these figures. And they keep getting hit, and they're screaming, and they're falling down, but then getting back up and running back into the woods. And then these red glowing eyes appear. And so they start shooting at these red glowing eyes, but there's no effect. And you still have these shadow people running along the wood line. For some reason, the family got this idea that the red eyes were a sort of diversion to keep them distracted against the shadow people. So instead of shooting towards the red glowing eyes, they start shooting the shadow people instead. And the same thing happens. They get hit, they scream, and then they run back into the woods.
And very strangely then, this is one of the weirdest elements to me of the story, is that another dark form was visible in the field that looked like a horse, but was not the family horse that they knew was in the barn. Knowing this, they shot at the horse, hit it, it screamed, and kind of morphed into the other black-looking figure, which then ran off into the woods. As if that's not strange enough.
And they're staring out over this cornfield that's across the street. It's about 3:30 in the morning, and this white light just appears over the cornfield. And one of the family members says that they felt the glow of the light hit them in the head. And they're like kind of put in this trance, and they start to stagger. They're almost falling off the roof. The other family members see this, shoot at the white light. It goes out, seemingly releasing its trance on the other guy. And he falls down, he's almost unconscious, and it leaves him with a headache for the rest of the day. And if all of this seems pretty vague, it's because it is. I'm trying to be as specific as I can, but there are no names given. Robert S. is the only one that is given. None of the other family members are named, none of the other family members are quantified in any way, and we'll get to that in a little bit as well. But the night isn't over. The insanity keeps going.
They also saw something that was like an orb falling through the air. They described it in terms of the color was like a glowing red coal. It sort of came to a stop in a tree branch, took the form of an owl, they said. And then I forget if they shot at it or that it just changed as it fell through the tree. But by the time it hit the ground, it scampered off on 4 legs into the woods. And then a cigar box shaped UFO flies over the house silently. It was ringed by blue lights. There was a red light in the middle. One of the guys shoots at that object, evidently hits it because the red light goes out and it never comes back on again, but it doesn't affect the flight of the object. It flies off silently.
Now, Politis comes back out the morning of July 4th to investigate a quick little event that happened on the night of the 3rd, which involved the family members shooting at this shadow person. It fell down, screaming, growling, for about 30 seconds it laid on the ground, and then it got up and ran away. And so they're checking out the area where it had fallen, and they find more of these strange 3-toed tracks. And these ones are a little bit different because now there seems to be more of a foot attached to them. They're about 14 inches long, 6 inches wide. And there are 4 tracks total that he found, but he cast the 2 best ones. The others were more impression-like, less detailed. But interestingly, he says that there's like this twisted heel scuff mark thing going on that he says is common amongst 3-toed footprints happening in Maryland, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And I'm just like, what? This is like another like T-Rex tracks being found situation. He's just dropping information that's like, where are you getting this from? What is happening? So seriously, if anyone has any idea of what he's talking about, please let me know. But pivoting from that, I do want to talk about something that we do know about, and that is the location. Rome, Ohio. You know, why is everything happening here? Why is everything, all condensed into this one location in northern Ohio? Is there something about the location that's special?
Rome, Ohio is a small, rural area with a lot of farmland, but very wooded. And the woods around it are unique to northern Ohio, at least these days. They're the last remnants of the great swamps that used to be up here. And so if you ask me, there's no better spot to set your cryptid monster story than the swampy rural regions around Rome, just because the woods really are not like anything else around here. They're called hemlock swamps, that they're pine trees, but the forest floor is all mud and swamp, and it's quite interesting. It's an area that's very reminiscent of southern Appalachia, or maybe central Appalachia, like Tennessee. Culturally, it's very similar, which is unique for the area. Getting into Ashtabula is culturally Appalachian, but sort of the environment itself, parts of it very much remind me of like Tennessee, which is not the vibe of the rest of Northeast Ohio. Part of how wild this area is that it's the one area in northern Ohio where there's rattlesnakes, is within these swamps. You know, if I was to speculate where an undiscovered giant primate would want to live, there's no better place to hide away. So that's the thing with this, is it's the give and take of believable and unbelievable, where if you're of the mind that there are giant bipedal primates out in our woods, and sometimes they're seen under really bad conditions, and so you think there's high strangeness afoot. If you're of that mindset, there's way too much high strangeness in this story to give that credibility. But if you lean too far the other way, then you can kind of get lost in wanting any factual basis to the matter whatsoever. Maybe.
The reasons for the location make sense, but I did want to go deeper. I wanted, like, why this family? Why are all these events, centered around this one particular group of people? It seems strange. It's so isolated, and of course, the location itself is fairly isolated, but if there's all this happening, if there's all this shooting going on, and all these shadow people screaming and UFOs being seen up above and white lights appearing over cornfields, you would really feel like other people would be seeing that, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. So maybe there's something else happening here, because it's not a Bigfoot case, and it's not even a UFO case. This is a high strangeness case with some very, very strange and very, very intense things happening.
The way Pilichas sets up the story of it being the gas pipeline, I think is a fun conflict to start the story. Just the idea that almost just maybe these creatures were just in the woods, and then the lumber people came in and cut down the trees to build this pipeline, and so they were disturbed. Then they came out with a vengeance, sort of attacking back, almost Ape Canyon-esque, one of these revenge stories. This really is textbook high strangeness. You have Bigfoots with red glowing eyes and UFOs being seen simultaneously and consistently in the same area. What's really unique and stands out to me with Night Siege is it's not as much a region of the country, like with the Chestnut Ridge or wherever, Skinwalker Ranch, but it's everything happening at once, concurrently. It's not as much, they see a Bigfoot one night, then they see a UFO another night, even though that does happen. They're seeing Bigfoots and UFOs and shadow people all at the same time, all at once.
At the same time, there is a really interesting detail that Pilichas slips into this. And he says that there is some sort of linkage, he thought, between Robert S.'s one son and the stuff that was happening all around them. And he couldn't determine if this son was disturbed by the strange activity or if he was just disturbed in general, and almost implying that the son of his was somehow generating the activity that we're seeing, much in the same way. It's not clearly stated this way in the book, but the implication is there that exists along with many poltergeist activity stories that often have one sort of teen or preteen member of the household, it's usually a young girl, who's going through some sort of distress or life change, and then in some way generates this activity happening around him. Pilichas just sort of lets that detail dangle there, but he does include it I think he wants it to be noticed, or else why put it in the text?
So the situation draws interesting parallels between, poltergeist cases, but it's still like a lot to kind of swallow. To suggest that all of this is the product of one person's mind, it's a lot. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot to sort of accept, But given how vague the text itself is, you can't say one way or the other. But what we do know is that it's a story that's taking place in rural Ohio, similar to a location like Minerva. You have a history of Ohio Bigfoot sightings. You have Dennis Politis, who is obviously a Stan Gordon fan, and it's all really ripe for this kind of story. But, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so before we conclude the story, let's get back to it, because there's still a little bit more. That's very, very important. Activity continues on the property, and then on
July 6th, 1981, Dennis Politis, an acquaintance of his named Willard McIntyre, and James Carnes go out to the site themselves for the purposes of investigation. And they find tracks and impressions that they were impressed by. They took pictures of it. They did as much audio recording as they could. They also located footprints that were not three-toed, but were more classic Sasquatch shaped in the ground. And a great deal is made out of the fact that they had a swirl effect around the footprints that would be likened to crop circles almost. And there's even an illustration, a hand-drawn illustration of this effect in the text of the book itself. And then at night, all of the researchers that I've named see the red-eyed creatures approaching. The typical stuff at this point that was associated with this experience starts happening. Politis and McIntyre decide to throw rocks into the woods where they see these red-eyed creatures milling about. The rocks are thrown back at them, which of course gets their attention. And it all culminates in the researchers shooting at these things. Dennis Politis writes about he's holding a flashlight directly on one of these creatures, holds it on the face of whatever this is with the red eyes, so that the other guys can get as clear shot as possible at it. And he writes in that book he'll never forget that minute or minute and a half of holding a flashlight beam on whatever this thing was. It was right in his sights. It was so well illuminated that he saw black fur on it, he said. He saw that it was casting a shadow on the tree behind it. Politis was pretty shaken by this particular experience.
So now's the biggest time jump in the book. It goes from an almost daily recounting of the story to inexplicably a 1 month time jump, and now we're in August. And the story just picks up with Politis getting a call from McIntyre, who wants to go back to the property.
Politis says, okay, let's go. And they take a friend of theirs named Larry Peters with them this time. On this occasion, what's really kind of extremely weird and significant is they decide to do this experiment with rabbits. They tie rabbits to this high-tension parachute cord. The cord is tied to a metal milk carton carrier, and the rabbits are put underneath that. I don't know how exactly this works, but there's a cyanide cap that's put into the rabbits, and the poison is only released if the rabbits are consumed while still living. So the whole idea is to try to get a Sasquatch to come in, grab the rabbit, start chomping on it, and get poisoned. So in order to make this an even more attractive lure, they play a tape loop of rabbits screaming. So it's an incredible scene to try to visualize. Unfortunately, if you're having trouble visualizing that, there are helpful illustrations in Night Siege that recreate what it would have looked like if Bigfoot had taken the bait. Well, most of the night passes and nothing really takes place. McIntyre does shoot at something that he sees right by the barn. And in a very cryptic passage, it simply says that Larry Peters had, and I quote, intense psychological interactions with the creatures. That's never elaborated upon. Pilichus does say there may be more of this to come, but I'll release that later on. But it doesn't appear in Night Siege itself. And things after that really died down. I think the family goes to sleep because nothing's happening. And then all of a sudden it's discovered one of the rabbits is gone. And that results in a flurry of activity. There's allegedly numerous sort of normal five-toed tracks that are found all around the place where the trap had been disturbed. This presumably unbreakable cord had been snapped and not cut. It had not been chewed, but it had appeared to have been heated around the outer edge of it before it had been broken. So all of that is to say, one rabbit was taken. It was never determined by what exactly or where that rabbit got to, but that really is the place at which the Night Siege sightings and reports stop. You know, the book concludes with kind of a long list of sighting reports in which Bigfoot has been shot at with no result. And then there's a few concluding paragraphs that talk about there's much more to the Night Siege story. Pilichus says, I may start a Night Siege newsletter to release more and more information about this ongoing case, but as far as I'm aware, nothing else has ever come out about this story.
And that's the big mystery of Night Siege. There isn't any more. There's nothing else to it. And that's what's so weird about it. Because Pilichus, at least according to public record, passed away in 2022, leaving him some odd 40 years to follow up on this case. And he just didn't. Why?
Why was it never followed up on to the degree? I have to say that I don't know that it wasn't. Part of it is the paper trail. In order to find out if it was followed up on or if the Night Siege newsletter ever actually took shape, you would have to locate those writings. And if they still exist, they exist in somebody's shoebox in their attic, or if they're a real careful archivist and curator, you know, they're in a 3-ring binder somewhere. But that's the only place that those would exist. And so I think that's the essential difficulty. The other reason why, and this is pure speculation, is if it were brought to light that this was somehow engineered or fabricated and Pilichus found out about it. Well, imagine it. Well, I'll say it this way. If Pilichus was as interested in the truth as he claims to be in the introduction to Night Siege, then with hat in hand, he would have to publish some sort of, you know, the truth has come to light that none of this was actually what I thought it was. A more human reaction would be to not say anything and hope that it all blows over and that nobody really digs into it because of embarrassment. You know, no one wants to find out that a big one had been pulled over on your account. But pre-internet, it was a lot easier to just let things ride and hope that nobody asks the question that we're asking, which is what happened after 1982.
And so here we go. Was it all a hoax? Could it have all been a hoax? And if so, who hoaxed what? Who hoaxed who? Show me your friends and I'll show you your future.
One of the researchers who is with Pilichus is a man by the name of Willard McIntyre. Willard McIntyre is probably the most interesting character that we can verify in the story, especially the more you dig into him. He's from an organization named Marson, and I've seen various explanations of to what the acronym is even for. That almost gets folkloric, because there's more than one reading of that acronym. But Willard McIntyre is known to have been a hoaxer. And in fact, he's associated with something that's known as the Tomato Man, which is a proven hoaxed photo of a supposed alien body. As of this morning, I was researching this, and I came across an old blog article from Ron Schaffner that sort of brought up some of these points and added that in personal contact with McIntyre, he said that Pilichus believed everything you told him and he'd be easy to hoax, and that he mentioned he was related, I think it's cousins, to one of the witnesses in Night Siege. So one of the possible theories for Night Siege is that it was hoaxed by one of the researchers there, but not Dennis Pilichus. That this was a hoax perpetrated on Pilichus. And I think that's a very likely theory because he is a known hoaxer. And when you look into the story, when you look into Night Siege, and this almost this breaks my heart to talk about, but you look into the story, Pilichus is only there a couple nights, and what he sees is from afar. The story of him with the flashlight is true, but you can only imagine the distances, and I don't know flashlight technology in the 80s, but I can imagine it's not what we would think of when we think of flashlight now. Firing blanks could happen. And you think of the coincidence, if that's even the right word, of there's this UFO Fortean researcher in a small town in rural eastern Ohio, and it just so happens that on the front page of his newspaper, there shows up this story. And that's an added wrinkle to this. And that's what's so interesting about this case, is a lot of the details, a lot of the facts of the matter that you look into, you can substantiate and give a very favorable reading to this story. But then what's withheld is what holds back the rest of the story. There's supposedly recordings of this stuff that took place. Now, granted, they couldn't have thrown it up on the internet at the time, but there's so much that if we had a little bit more, if we had a follow-up newsletter, if we had something, then more would be, we could understand more of this case. But what we don't have holds us back. We're at the crest of this wave of researchers being here or not. A lot of the people who are looking into this stuff in the 70s and 80s are passing away. And maybe some of those researchers got out of the game before the internet and things like that caught up. And so if we don't look into these things now, they're going to fade away even more. I think Night Siege just barely made it. If Night Siege wasn't digitized by somebody, it would be lost. Which is a weird call for internet archivalism, but it's what we need to make sure these stories continue. And I mean, Pilichus passed within, the last couple of years. And it certainly seems that with him passing, so does the hope of finding out anything more about this.
So you tell me, did Pilichus get hoaxed? Or was he in on it? Or did he believe in the whole thing and he did follow up on the story and there was a Night Siege newsletter, but because it was never digitized and because there maybe aren't very many copies left, we just don't know about it? It's a great question, but one that's probably not likely to be answered anytime soon.
What I find really interesting is people who never heard of Night Siege, would never know the stories, will tell you about how they've seen or experienced things out in Rome Township or out near Roaming Shores, one of these areas, Rock Creek. I've had that happen to me just with people who find out about me that I have an interest in Bigfoot. They'll tell me stories, and if you're around here, if they're not taking place in the national park or somewhere way in southern Ohio, if someone's going to tell you a Bigfoot story, this is where it happened. So the high strangeness may have ended, but Bigfoot being reported in the area hasn't stopped.
If I could talk to Dennis Polichis, I would begin by looking him right in the eye and saying, did you mean it when you wrote, this account is true? And what do you mean by that? When you say you held that flashlight on the face of a red-eyed creature for a minute straight, level with us. What did you see? You know, would you go into greater detail? Because frankly, Polichis, and he's upfront about this in his writing, a lot of information is withheld in what he's willing to talk about yet, for whatever reason. And I would love to have the opportunity to say, what didn't you write in Night Siege? What were you holding back on, and why?
I don't want this to become something huge because like I said, at least as of right now, there's nothing more to the story than what's in Polichis's writing. I have a few bits of research that kind of make a few small details clearer, but there's nothing more than what's there, like I've said before. But I don't want this to be blown out of proportion. Even though it's a really cool story and I love it, and it has a very soft spot in my heart, I don't think there's a lot there for us to look into anymore. Especially, there's not, as far as I know, there's no more continued high strangeness in Ashtabula.
So in the end, we'll probably never know the truth of it all, unless someone comes forward with, Night Siege newsletters or saying that they were there, and had involvement with the story, hoax or otherwise. So for now, it's just a mystery. And that's what I cover on this show. Mysteries and monsters. But really, I can't beat what Andy said at the end there. And Andy really is the guy. He is the Night Siege guy now that Polichis has passed away. And that gives me hope. And here's why. Because if you're a longtime follower of this channel or of Small Town Monsters in general, you'll know that, especially me, I haven't interviewed anybody really close to my age. I certainly haven't interviewed anyone younger than myself before. And Andy is younger than me. And Andy has looked into a case of high strangeness and has tried to verify, at least in some aspects, if it happened or not. And I think that's really, really important. And I think it's important that it's not dying. Fortean research isn't dying. Because, not gonna lie, it seems to be the older generation that's interested in this stuff and not much of my generation. And if they are of my generation, they're not really interested in verifying details or doing the work like Andy has done or what I have done with the Temecula UFO cult or anything like that. They're just interested in the stories. And we're not here for the stories. We're here to verify the stories. And so, all the real researchers that are around my age, I can name on both of my hands. That's not very many people. And so seeing people like Andy, and while Andy isn't investigating other cases, he investigated one that was important to him. We need more people like that. We need more people investigating and verifying, maybe this is true, and drawing intelligent conclusions about these stories. But anyways, I'm off my soapbox now. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I know I had a lot of fun putting this one together because it's so bizarre and out there, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching it. So and if you did, leave a comment down below, hit the likes, hit the subscribes, and I'll see you guys in the next one.